Hey there, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep on a concept that's pretty fundamental to how we think about law and government,
Yeah.
legal obligation and authority.
Mm.
We're diving into excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy,
Oh, nice.
the ultimate playground for big thinkers,
Yeah.
to explore why we should or maybe shouldn't feel bound by laws, even the ones we don't like.
Absolutely. And this isn't just some abstract philosophical puzzle. It gets to the heart of what makes a society function.
Right.
We're all affected by laws, so understanding the basis of their power is crucial, especially for someone who enjoys a good philosophical debate.
Right. We're not just passively following rules.
Right.
We're trying to understand the why behind the what.
Yeah.
So first things first, what does it even mean to have an obligation within a legal system?
Right.
I mean, we know laws come with consequences, but is that all there is to it?
It's tempting to think so, but legal obligations are surprisingly slippery when you try to pin them down.
Okay.
It's not just about avoiding punishment. Okay, let's imagine two scenarios. In one, you pay your taxes because you're afraid of going to jail. In the other, you pay them because you believe it's your civic duty to contribute to public services.
Okay.
Both actions comply with the law,
Right.
but the underlying reasons are very different.
That's interesting. So the same action can be driven by completely different motivations.
Yes.
Does that mean the law doesn't really care why we obey as long as we do?
Well, that's where things get complex.
Okay.
Philosophers like Joseph Raz
Okay.
argue that legal obligations have a special kind of force. He calls them content-independent and preemptive reasons for action.
Okay, those are some big words, content independent and preemptive. Break it down for us. What did those actually mean in the context of law?
Okay, so imagine a speed limit.
Yeah.
Content independent means the reason you shouldn't speed isn't just because you think it's dangerous at this particular moment. It's because the law says so, regardless of the specific circumstances.
Right.
It's not asking for your individual assessment of the risks in that moment.
Right.
It's giving you a reason that applies regardless of your own views on the content of the action itself.
Okay, so it's like the law overrides my personal judgment, at least in certain situations.
Yes.
So how does this preemptive thing come into play?
Think of it this way. The law is cutting in line ahead of some of your other reasons for acting.
Oh.
It's saying, hey, even if you have good reasons to speed, maybe you're rushing someone to the hospital, the fact that it's against the law creates a very strong reason not to do it.
Right.
The legal obligation is meant to take priority, at least in some cases, over other reasons you might have.
So it's not that those other reasons are invalid.
Right.
It's that the law is trying to, as you said, preempt them to make itself the most important consideration. But wouldn't that make us all mindless robots just blindly following orders?
Not quite.
Uh.
It's not about excluding all other reasons.
Okay.
There are still situations where other considerations might outweigh the legal obligation. Think
Yeah.
self-defense, for example. Plus, we still need to judge whether the authority itself is legitimate, whether they're acting within their bounds, and so on.
Right.
It's more nuanced than just blind obedience.
So there's room for judgment, for critical thinking about when and how these legal obligations apply.
Exactly.
But this raises another question. Not all rules have this kind of force. If I tell someone not to step on my lawn,
Right.
that's not a law,
Yeah.
even if I get really mad if they do so. So
Yeah.
what makes legal authority different from just any kind of power someone might have?
That's the distinction between effective authority and justified authority. I might be able to stop someone from stepping on my lawn, but that doesn't mean I have the right to do so.
Okay.
Legal systems claim a much stronger kind of authority,
Oh,
a right to be obeyed, not just the ability to enforce rules.
So it's not just about the might of the law.
Right.
It's about the right of the law to tell us what to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that authority is somehow tied to this concept of obligation we've been wrestling with.
The classic view sees legal authority as demanding that we be guided by the law, not just comply with it out of fear. This is where a fascinating concept called the sources thesis comes into play.
Ah, yes, the sources thesis, another philosophical rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Do we really need to dive into that to understand this whole obligation thing?
It's worth exploring because it helps explain how law claims to have this authority over us, even if we disagree with specific laws.
Okay.
The sources thesis says we can identify a law as valid without needing to first solve all the moral debates it's trying to address.
So I don't have to agree that a law is good to acknowledge that it is a law.
Exactly. The idea is that law is grounded in its sources, things like legislation, court decisions, long-standing customs, and so on.
Right.
We can recognize a law as valid by looking at its pedigree, so to speak, even if we disagree with its content.
So it's like saying the process by which the law came into being gives it legitimacy, even if the outcome, the actual content of the law is something we find morally questionable.
That's a good way to put it. Of course, there are different conceptions of authority, some weaker, some broader.
Sure.
But this idea that law has a special claim on our actions, even when we disagree, is central to how we understand legal obligation.
Okay, I'm starting to see how these pieces fit together, but this brings us to the huge question, the one that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries.
Right,
Do we really have to obey the law?
right.
I mean, is there truly a moral obligation to follow every rule, even the ones we think are wrong?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's where things get even more philosophically interesting.
Okay.
It's famously captured in what's known as Wolff's puzzle.
Wolff's puzzle. I'm intrigued. Unravel this puzzle for us.
Okay.
What's so puzzling about whether we should obey the law? It seems like a pretty straightforward question.
Wolff asks, if I choose to obey each law on its merits, am I really obeying? Or am I just acting in accordance with my own judgment? If I decide that a law is just and therefore choose to follow it, am I truly submitting to the authority of the law? Or am I just following my own conscience? And on the flip side, if I genuinely submit to authority and obey a law simply because it is the law, haven't I given up my autonomy, my ability to think for myself?
That's a real head-scratcher. It seems like we're caught between two extremes. Either we're just doing what we think is right anyway, which isn't really obedience, or we're surrendering our judgment entirely, which feels like losing our freedom. But wait, we accept this kind of surrender or judgment in other areas of life, right?
Yeah.
Like if I promise to meet a friend, I'm obligated to keep that promise even if I'd rather stay home. So what makes legal authority different?
You've hit on a crucial point, the difference between personal obligations and legal ones. There are three key features of legal authority that make this question so much trickier. First, law is institutionalized. It's not just about personal whims or agreements between individuals.
Right.
It's tied to these powerful institutions that claim the right to make and enforce rules for everyone.
So it's not like breaking a promise to a friend. There's this whole system with real power behind it.
Exactly. Second, law has wide scope. It affects almost every aspect of our lives, from driving to marriage to taxes to free speech.
Yeah.
Unlike a contract for a specific transaction.
Right.
The law's reach is vast and often touches on very sensitive issues. It's hard to escape its influence.
It's everywhere, and that makes it feel much weightier than, say, agreeing to the rules of a board game.
Right. And third, maybe most importantly, law is morally fallible. It can get things wrong, sometimes very wrong. It can be unjust, biased, even downright cruel. And this is what makes obedience to law fundamentally different from, say, trusting a doctor's expertise. We can't just blindly assume that the law is always right or fair.
So we have to grapple with the possibility that the law might be deeply flawed, even while it's demanding our obedience.
Yeah.
That's a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see why this question of whether we have to obey the law even when we disagree is so complex. It's not just about following rules. It's about wrestling with power, justice, and the very nature of autonomy. Where do we even go from here?
Well, despite these challenges, philosophers haven't given up on trying to justify this obligation to obey the law.
Okay.
Over the centuries, they've come up with a whole range of theories, each with its own strengths and weaknesses, and that's what we'll be exploring in our next segment.
I'm ready to hear them. Bring on the theories.
So let's put these theories on trial, shall we? We'll lay out the most common arguments for why we should obey the law, and you can be the voice of, philosophical skepticism, poking holes wherever you see them.
Okay, I like it.
How does that sound?
I'm ready to play devil's advocate.
All right.
I'm already suspicious that there's no easy answer here, but I'm eager to hear what the, great minds have come up with.
All right, then let's start with one of the classics, the consent theory.
Okay.
It's the idea that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, like a social contract.
Right.
We agree to be ruled in exchange for the benefits of living in a society.
It's pretty straightforward, right?
It sounds nice in theory, like we're all signing on the dotted line, but honestly, does anyone actually consent to obey every single law? I mean, I never explicitly agreed to the speed limit on my street or to pay taxes on that, impulse purchase I made online.
That's a fair point.
Yeah.
Consent theorists often distinguish between consent to the system as a whole, maybe through voting or participating in democratic processes, and consent to every specific rule.
Okay.
But even that can be tricky. John Locke, the big proponent of consent theory, tried to argue for tacit consent. His idea was that if you live in a place and benefit from its laws, you've implicitly consented to them.
tacit consent. So just by existing and going about my life,
Yeah.
I'm somehow agreeing to follow every rule in the book. I'm not buying it. I didn't sign any contract when I was born, and I certainly haven't had a chance to, negotiate the terms of my citizenship. Plus, what about people who can't just up and leave if they disagree with the laws?
Right.
Doesn't seem like a free choice for them. You're hitting on the key weakness of consent theory.
Okay.
It's very hard to show that this kind of blanket consent actually exists in the real world. Even explicit oaths, like those taken by naturalized citizens or public officials, are usually understood as consent to the system of government, not necessarily blind obedience to every single law.
Okay, so if getting genuine universal consent is practically impossible,
Yeah.
what other justifications are on the table? Surely philosophers have come up with something a bit more, concrete.
Let's move on to fairness then.
Okay.
This one focuses on reciprocity.
Okay.
We get all sorts of benefits from living in a society, security, infrastructure, public services, so maybe obeying the law is our way of contributing, of pulling our weight, and being fair to our fellow citizens who are also following the rules.
I can see that. It's like we're all in this together,
Yeah.
and we each have a responsibility to make the system work. But what if those benefits aren't actually distributed fairly? What if the system is rigged to benefit certain groups at the expense of others? Why should those who are getting a raw deal feel obligated to play by the rules?
That's a crucial point. Fairness theories rely on the assumption that everyone is genuinely benefiting from the system and that the burdens and benefits are distributed justly. But as you point out, that's often not the reality.
Right.
And then there's the problem of open benefits, things like clean air or national defense that we all benefit from, even if we don't actively choose to.
Yeah.
It's hard to argue that we owe the state obedience simply because we breathe the air or enjoy a sense of security that we can't really opt out of.
Right. It's like saying I owe the fire department a lifetime of service because they put out a fire in my neighborhood.
Yeah,
Even though I never asked them to, it doesn't quite add up.
exactly.
So if fairness isn't the magic bullet, what about something more emotional, something like gratitude? Maybe we should obey the law out of a sense of thankfulness for all the good things the state provides.
Gratitude is an interesting one. On the surface, it seems appealing. We should be grateful for things like protection from harm or access to public goods, but can we really feel genuine gratitude towards an abstract entity like the state? It's not like it's personally giving us gifts out of the kindness of its heart.
It's more like a complex system that we're part of,
Right.
whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure you can force gratitude.
Yeah.
I'm glad I have access to health care, but I didn't exactly choose to pay taxes to fund it.
Yeah.
It feels more like an obligation than a gift.
Exactly. Genuine gratitude usually involves a voluntary act by the giver and a recognition of their intention to benefit us. It's hard to apply that to a vast impersonal state apparatus. Plus, are we really obligated to do whatever the state demands simply because we're thankful for some of the things it provides? Gratitude, while admirable, doesn't seem like a strong enough foundation for a broad duty to obey all laws.
So far, it seems like we've tried to build a case for legal obligation on a foundation of sand. Consent is elusive. Fairness is often absent, and gratitude feels misplaced. Are there any other contenders in this philosophical battle royale, or should we just throw up our hands and embrace anarchy?
Don't give up on us philosophers just yet. We have a few more tricks up our sleeves. So far, we've been focusing on what you might call transactional justifications, consent, fairness, gratitude, as if our relationship with the state is some kind of bargain. But there are other approaches that dig a bit deeper, exploring the inherent value of authority itself.
Okay, I'm all ears. Let's move beyond these transactional models and see what other insights we can find. All right, so we've debunked the usual suspects: consent, fairness, gratitude. They all have some pretty serious flaws. What other arguments are there for why we should obey the law?
Let's shift gears a bit and think about the potential benefits of having a system of legal authority rather than focusing solely on our obligations to the state. One compelling line of thought centers on the instrumental value of authority.
Instrumental value, meaning like the law is a tool that helps us achieve something. What could that something be?
Think of it this way. Even if we disagree with a particular law, maybe obeying it actually helps us achieve better outcomes overall. This is captured in what Joseph Raz calls the normal justification thesis.
Okay, I'm listening. How does this normal justification work? Does it mean we should just blindly trust that the law knows what's best for us?
Not exactly blind trust, but rather a recognition that sometimes authority can actually help us act better than we would on our own. It's like following a doctor's advice, even if we don't fully understand the medical reasoning. We defer to their expertise because we believe they'll lead us to better health outcomes.
So the law as a kind of expert guide helping us navigate complex situations and avoid making bad decisions.
Right.
I guess that makes sense for things like traffic laws. We all benefit from having a system that prevents chaos on the roads.
Exactly. Traffic laws are a classic example. Imagine if everyone just drove however they pleased with no regard for rules or speed limits. It would be a disaster. The law, in this case, provides a framework that helps us coordinate our actions and achieve a common good that we wouldn't be able to achieve on our own.
But surely not all laws are like traffic regulations. What about laws that are more about enforcing moral values, things people might reasonably disagree about? Does the normal justification apply there too?
That's where things get trickier. The instrumental justification seems strongest for laws that solve coordination problems or prevent harm,
Right.
but it becomes more questionable when the law is trying to shape our behavior in ways that are less about objective benefits and more about subjective values.
Right, because who gets to decide which moral values the law should enforce? I might agree that stealing is wrong, but what about laws that restrict certain forms of speech or dictate what kind of relationships people can have? It feels like a slippery slope if we just assume that any law is justified as long as the state believes it's good for us.
That's a valid concern. And it highlights another limitation of purely instrumental justifications. They tend to focus on the outcomes, the supposed benefits of a law, without paying enough attention to the process by which that law was created.
So it's not just about the ends, it's also about the means. A law might have good intentions, but if it was created through an unjust process that undermines its legitimacy.
Precisely. We often care about whether a law reflects the will of the people, whether it was created through fair and democratic procedures. Even if a law produces good outcomes, if it wasn't arrived at in a just way, that raises questions about its authority.
Okay, so instrumental justifications have their limits. They work well for certain kinds of practical problems, but get murky when we're talking about moral values or the process of lawmaking. What other philosophical paths can we explore?
Let's turn to an idea that's grounded in our moral intuitions rather than practical benefits, the concept of a natural duty to support just institutions.
A natural duty. You mean like a moral obligation that exists even without any explicit agreement or contract?
Exactly. The argument here is that we have a responsibility to uphold institutions that are essential for a just and stable society,
Yeah.
even if those institutions are imperfect.
No.
It's like a duty to cooperate, to contribute to the common good, even if it means making some personal sacrifices.
I can get behind the idea that we have a moral responsibility to make society work, to not let things descend into chaos. But doesn't this natural duty get awfully vague? How do we know which institutions deserve our support? What if there are multiple states claiming authority or none of them seem particularly just?
That's one of the challenges with natural duty theories. They rely on a shared sense of what constitutes a just institution, and that's obviously open to debate. John Rawls, a prominent political philosopher, talks about a duty to support just institutions that apply to us. But as you point out, figuring out which ones apply in a complex world with overlapping jurisdictions and competing claims can be incredibly difficult.
Yeah, it's not like we get a personalized rule book at birth that says, obey these laws, but not those.
Right.
It's much messier than that.
Absolutely. And even if we could agree on which institutions are generally just, does that automatically mean we owe them absolute obedience? Or is it more about a duty to cooperate, to not actively undermine them, while still reserving the right to critique and challenge specific laws we find unjust?
That sounds more reasonable. A general duty to support just institutions while still retaining our critical faculties and our right to dissent that feels more in line with the kind of engaged citizenship we should be striving for.
Indeed. And finally, let's touch on a fascinating approach that moves beyond both transactional justifications and appeals to natural duties, the idea of constitutive obligations.
Constitutive obligations. All right, I'm officially intrigued. What makes these obligations different from the ones we've already discussed?
This view suggests that the obligation to obey the law isn't something we need to justify with external principles like consent or fairness. Instead, it's built into the very fabric of what it means to be part of a political community. It's like saying the obligation isn't external, it's internal, part of our identity as members of that society.
So instead of viewing the law as something imposed on us from the outside, we see it as something we're already a part of, something we're partly responsible for shaping and upholding.
Exactly. Think of obligations to family. We often feel we owe certain things to our parents or siblings, not because of some contract we signed, but because of the special relationship we have. It's part of what it means to be a good son, daughter, brother, or sister.
That makes sense on a personal level, but can that feeling of connection and responsibility really apply to a vast, impersonal state where we don't even know most of our fellow citizens? I mean, it's not like I have a personal relationship with the lawmakers in Washington.
That's a valid challenge. It's hard to feel that same sense of intimacy and shared fate when we're talking about millions of strangers. But proponents of constitutive obligations argue that even in large modern societies, there's still a sense in which we're bound together by shared values, institutions, and a common history.
So it's about seeing ourselves as part of a larger whole, recognizing that our actions have an impact on others, and that the law reflects, however imperfectly, a set of shared commitments that we're all bound by.
That's the essence of it. Ronald Dworkin, a prominent advocate for this view, argues that we have a duty to take the law seriously, to try and see it as reflecting a common good that we're all part of. This doesn't mean blind obedience, of course. It's more about an attitude of good faith engagement with the system, recognizing that even if we disagree with specific laws, we still have a responsibility to try and understand and interpret them in a way that makes sense of our shared political project.
So constitutive obligations are less about following rules and more about having a certain mindset, a way of approaching our role as citizens within a system of law.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're not just passive subjects of the law, but active participants in shaping and reshaping it through our engagement, our interpretations, and even our dissent.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground here. We've explored consent, fairness, gratitude, instrumental justifications, natural duties, and now constitutive obligations. It's like we've taken a crash course in political philosophy. But here's the thing that strikes me. We haven't found a single knockdown argument for why we must obey all laws, no matter what.
That's a keen observation. Each theory has its appeal, its insights, but none seems to fully capture the complexity of the relationship between individuals and the state, especially for someone with a philosophical mind. And that leads us to a very interesting question. What does it mean that even brilliant minds have struggled for centuries to find a definitive answer to the seemingly basic question of whether we have a duty to obey the law?
So are we off the hook? Does this philosophical deadlock mean anarchy wins and we can all just do whatever we want?
Not quite. The absence of a single airtight justification doesn't mean there's no reason to obey the law.
Well,
It simply suggests that our relationship with the law is more nuanced, more complex than a simple command obedience model.
so instead of blind obedience, we need a more critical, more discerning approach.
Right.
But what would that look like in practice? How do we decide which laws deserve our respect and which ones we might be justified in resisting?
That's where things get really interesting and where each of us has to grapple with these questions on a personal level. Instead of asking, do I have a duty to obey the law? In general, we might need to ask, does this particular law deserve my obedience? We might consider things like, is it just? Does it violate fundamental rights? Was it created through a fair and democratic process? Does it truly serve the common good? And crucially, what are the potential consequences of obeying or disobeying?
So it's less about following a set of abstract rules and more about engaging in a kind of ongoing moral deliberation about our relationship with the law. It sounds like a lot of responsibility.
It is. But it's also empowering. It means recognizing that we're not just passive subjects of the law, but moral agents with the capacity for judgment, for critical thinking, and for making choices that align with our values.
So skepticism about a universal obligation to obey doesn't lead to chaos. It leads to a more engaged, more thoughtful form of citizenship. It's about questioning, deliberating, and holding both ourselves and our institutions accountable.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the moral complexities of living in a society governed by laws and embracing the challenge of navigating those complexities with wisdom and integrity.
Well, that was a whirlwind tour of some deep philosophical waters. We've gone from defining obligations and authority to wrestling with consent, fairness, gratitude, and the very nature of just institutions. It's like we've upgraded our mental operating systems when it comes to understanding the law.
And hopefully we've equipped you with the tools to continue exploring these questions on your own, to engage in those ongoing conversations about what it means to live a good and just life within a system of law.
Exactly. So here's something to ponder as you navigate the legal landscape. If even the brightest minds in philosophy haven't definitively cracked the code of political obligation, how should we, as everyday citizens, approach this dilemma? What criteria should guide our decisions about when to comply and when to resist? The deep dive continues in your own mind. Until next time.